It was a late evening in June 1985 on the outskirts of Moscow. The light was already draining from the sky, leaving a flat grey band over rows of low apartment blocks and the dull silhouettes of factory chimneys. In front of a small, aging Zhiguli sedan, the city glowed faintly in the distance. Behind it, at a disciplined distance, a dark Volga kept pace with every turn of the wheel. At the wheel of the Zhiguli sat Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev, 58 years old, engineer at the Phasotron Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering. To any passerby, he was just another tired Soviet specialist driving home after a long day at a classified defense enterprise. The same grey jacket, the same briefcase, the same weary profile. According to the internal report, KGB officers would write that night, "It was on that drive back toward the city that they chose to move." It was the end of a multi-year operation, built from fragments of suspicion and pieces of information bought in Washington, rested on and revised, guarded with the bureaucratic patience of a security state that believed it could outlast any individual. The man in the Zhiguli had already cost the Soviet Union more than any spy in its history. In internal estimates on the other side of the ocean, in a building in Langley, Virginia, his information had been valued in the billions of dollars. In Moscow, the calculation was different. Years of research compromised, entire radar systems exposed, the prestige of the military-industrial complex humiliated. Just before the city limits, when the glow of Moscow's streetlights began to thicken, the Volga closed the gap. The last drive home was over. Years earlier, the same city had already begun to crack, even if its surface still looked solid. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union lived in what official historians would later call the era of stagnation. Brezhnev's portraits hung above factory gates and school blackboards. The slogans still promised victory of socialism and scientific progress. But the queues for sausage and butter told their own story, as did the peeling stairwells of concrete apartment blocks and the permanently broken elevators. The state was tired, but its security organs were not. The KGB's second chief directorate, responsible for counterintelligence inside the country, traced lines of surveillance over Moscow like a second invisible city. Listening posts, informants, observation points in apartments opposite embassies, cars with civilian plates that never strayed far from certain streets. If a foreign diplomat walked into a grocery shop, somewhere a brief note went into a file. If an engineer at a sensitive institute started asking unusual questions, the file got thicker. At the same time, the military-industrial complex devoured resources. Phasotron, housed in an unremarkable building with guards at the gate and a tangle of power lines overhead, worked on the radar sets that would sit in the noses of MiG-29s, MiG-31s, Su-27s. Those radars were the eyes that were supposed to spot American bombers and fighters in time, in all weather, against all tricks. If they failed, the Soviet Union's airspace was paper thin. On the other side of the world, at the Pentagon, men stared at charts and briefing slides that stopped where Soviet secrecy began. They had theories and projections about how far those radars could see, what frequencies they used, how they would react to jamming. They needed something else. Not guesses, not modelling, but actual documents. The kind that sat in safes and technical libraries inside places like Phasotron. Between those two needs, the Soviet need for secrecy and the American hunger for detail, stood the everyday life of Soviet citizens in Moscow, communal apartments with thin walls, kitchens where radios whispered foreign broadcasts when neighbours were out, stairwells where children played war games, while their parents avoided talking politics in anything louder than a murmur. Inside one such apartment lived a small, tidy family that looked, on paper, completely loyal. Adolf Tolkachev had been born in 1927 in what was then the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. He moved through the Soviet education system in the way destined for a promising technical student. Studies at a polytechnic institute, an engineering career in the defense sector, assignments on important projects. His personnel file was clean. His work evaluations praised his competence, his seriousness, his reliability. What the file did not show was the private archive in his head. His wife's family had been broken under Stalin. Relatives arrested, exiled, forbidden from living in large cities, jobs lost, not because of incompetence, but because of accusations that could never be discussed openly. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the state congratulated itself for having left the excesses of Stalinism behind, those scars remained in the lives of people like the Tolkachevs. They were a quiet indictment that never made it into print. In the evenings, in that cramped Moscow apartment, Adolf read what he could find that had slipped through censorship. Solzhenitsyn's descriptions of the Gulag, samizdat copies of banned essays, foreign magazines passed hand to hand. He watched his son grow up into another generation that would be told to be grateful while being offered little but shortages and slogans. By day, he moved through Phasotron's corridors with his identification badge in place, signing out highly classified documents as part of his work. By night, he reread the history of his own family, not in official books, but in letters and memories. Slowly, an intention hardened that had nothing to do with money. He did not want to escape the system. He wanted to hurt it. The decision to act took a form that, on paper, looked almost absurdly naive. In 1977 and 1978, American diplomats in Moscow began to find handwritten notes under the wiper blades of their cars. The notes were brief, in Russian, and oddly phrased. The writer claimed to have access to extremely valuable military secrets and wanted to make contact with the CIA. There was just enough technical detail, only a few phrases, a project name here, a reference to radar parameters there, to make it hard to ignore. Inside the US Embassy compound on Novinsky Boulevard, the reaction was cautious. The CIA station in Moscow lived under the rule that all case officers there knew by heart: Moscow rules. Those rules said that any spontaneous approach could be a provocation. The KGB had a long tradition of dangling supposed volunteers in front of foreign intelligence to see who tried to bite. The first notes were put aside. Then more appeared. Each time, the unknown author took new risks. He lingered longer near embassy cars. He hovered just enough within range of the surveillance cameras mounted on lampposts to see what would happen. He could not know that, in a secure room inside the embassy, his scrawled handwriting lay on a table while officers argued about whether he was genuine or a trap. Eventually, the volume of technical references in the notes forced a decision. The station chief agreed that a controlled contact could be attempted. A Russian-speaking case officer was assigned, trained to move under heavy surveillance, instructed to assume that every step could be watched. When they finally met the man who had been leaving the notes, there was nothing about him that looked like a character from a spy novel. No expensive coat, no dramatic flair. Just a thin, unremarkable engineer with tired eyes and a meticulous way of speaking. He produced, at that first contact, something that changed his status forever. A small sample of technical information, enough for analysts in Washington to recognize that they were looking not at fantasies, but at the internal design of Soviet radar systems that had never appeared in any Western collection. The CIA gave him a code name and a camera. The Soviet state had given him access and motive. The rest he would build himself. In the years that followed, Adolf Tolkachev lived two lives layered over the same daily routine. Early in the morning, he left his apartment like any other engineer, joining the flow of commuters toward Phasotron. He passed the armed guards at the gate, showed his pass, walked familiar staircases. He signed out classified documents from a secure reading room. He attended meetings where new generations of radar and missile guidance systems were discussed under portraits of party leaders. Some days, when the opportunity arose, he took certain documents not just to the reading room, but to a place where he could be briefly alone: a bathroom, a small side office, a storage space. There, in hurried minutes, he unfolded pages on a flat surface and used a tiny camera that fit in his hand to photograph them, frame by frame. Then he returned them to the file circulation as if nothing had happened. At lunchtime, he ate in the canteen, like everyone else. In the evenings, when he left the institute, he sometimes followed pre-arranged routes through the city to either deliver exposed film or receive new instructions. Moscow's streets, which to ordinary citizens were just lines between work and home, became a board on which he and his handlers moved according to strict rules: no direct walks from embassy to meeting point, no predictable patterns, visual checks for tails, abort signals that might never be needed but could never be forgotten. In his communications with the CIA, he asked for money, but not as a central motivation. He wanted things that were otherwise unavailable: Western medications, books, music that his son might like, foreign consumer goods that symbolized a life outside the grey Soviet market. The payments he received accumulated in secret accounts and in bundles of rubles that he could barely spend without drawing attention. From Langley's point of view, the balance sheet was spectacular. The film he provided contained internal design documents for radar systems that equipped frontline fighters. It revealed vulnerabilities, actual performance figures under different conditions, update plans. It covered new missile designs, countermeasure systems, and the broader doctrine of how Soviet air defense intended to fight. In briefing rooms thousands of kilometers away from Moscow, officers could finally draw their arrows and symbols on maps with real numbers rather than guesses. American aircraft could be equipped, trained, and tactically deployed with knowledge of exactly where Soviet eyes could and could not see. It was not an exaggeration in that context to estimate the value of this information in billions of dollars of saved research and in the potential lives of pilots who might never be shot down because someone in Moscow had quietly turned on a camera in a bathroom. Inside the CIA, some officers started calling him a billion-dollar spy. The nickname would survive long after he did. Back in Moscow, the environment around him tightened. The KGB did not know his name yet, but they knew something was wrong. Test trials and exercises revealed gaps and anomalies that could not be easily explained. Certain Western countermeasures seemed too well calibrated. Intelligence fragments indicated that Western analysts spoke with unusual confidence about systems that were supposed to be secrets. The second Chief Directorate began to focus more intensely on research institutes connected with air defense and aviation. That meant more observation, more informants, more checks. It meant re-examining personnel files, revisiting the question of who had access to what, and whether anyone's lifestyle hinted at unexplained income. Phasotron was an obvious priority. Guards were reminded to watch for unusual behavior. Security officers sat in on meetings. Quiet conversations were held with some employees about their attitudes, their families, their contacts. At the same time, operating in Moscow became harder for the CIA. Case officers were followed more aggressively. Phones were interfered with. Cars were bumped, delayed in traffic, blocked. Meetings had to be postponed, routes altered, or cancelled altogether. Each aborted contact left a question mark hanging over the name of the source who might be waiting somewhere, exposed, counting on a plan that could no longer be safely executed. Inside the CIA, the question of extraction came up again and again. Some officers argued that Adolf should be brought out, with his family, in a carefully prepared operation. Others countered that Moscow was too dangerous. that the likelihood of failure was too high, and that the cost of a failed exfiltration would be catastrophic, not only for him, but for the entire American presence in the Soviet capital. They argued that as long as he remained alive and active, the information was too valuable to lose, and that any extraction would need to be postponed until circumstances changed. On paper, the debate was about risk management. In practice, it was about how much danger one man and his family were expected to carry on their shoulders so that another state could redraw its tactical manuals. While that argument remained unresolved, another process, thousands of kilometers away, quietly narrowed his odds to almost zero. In the early 1980s, a different man sat in an office in the United States, looking at his own resentments. Edward Lee Howard had been trained by the CIA, prepared for an assignment in Moscow, and then abruptly fired after failing polygraph tests and facing accusations of misconduct. Bitter and humiliated, he drifted, drank, and eventually walked into the arms of the very organization he had been meant to work against. Howard began to provide the KGB with details about how the CIA operated, particularly in Moscow. He described training, methods, typical cover stories, and the patterns used to handle sources. He may not have known names, but he knew architecture. How a case like Tolkachev's would be set up, what kind of signals would be used, how meetings could be detected. Not long after, another man in an entirely different position decided that the promise of money and a double life was worth more than the oath he had sworn. Aldrich Ames, a counterintelligence officer in the CIA, began to sell the identities of key American sources inside the Soviet Union to the KGB. He had access to lists that had been compiled precisely to protect those sources, and he turned those protections into weapons against them. Taken together, the two betrayals formed a missing piece the KGB needed. They already suspected leaks in certain areas. Now they had enough insight into CIA methods and enough data about actual sources to begin to match one with the other. In later Soviet and Russian accounts, the picture is deliberately blurred. Some narratives emphasize Howard, others Ames. Still others hint at separate internal discoveries. What is consistent is the result. By the mid-1980s, KGB counterintelligence could put operational footprints and analytical suspicions together, and draw a line that pointed straight into phasotron. From that point onward, the billion-dollar spy was no longer just an abstract problem in a briefing. He was a target to be physically taken. The operation to arrest him was prepared with the same administrative thoroughness that had characterized his recruitment, just in reverse. Surveillance teams watched the embassy and known CIA officers. They tracked patterns, cars, movements. They followed some of those cars to see where in the city they went, which streets they favored, which parking spots they chose. They did not need to know at the outset which contact was with which source. They just needed to be close enough, often enough, to be present when a mistake occurred. Reconstructing the operation from fragmentary declassified material and memoirs, one sees a grim patience. They did not rush to seize him in the office, where colleagues might see. They did not storm his apartment, provoking noise and attention. They chose instead a moment of transition, the road between an outer district and the city, where traffic could be controlled and the move would be over in seconds. On that June evening in 1985, as Adolf drove his Zhiguli toward Moscow, he had with him a small capsule, a cyanide pill provided by the CIA, to ensure that if he were taken, interrogation would be brief. It was a standard bleak insurance in the world he had entered. The Volga that had been following him gradually closed the distance. At a prearranged spot, another vehicle joined, narrowing his path. The maneuver that followed was simple and practiced. Cut off the front, press from behind, force the car to stop. Doors opened. Men in plain clothes moved in with speed that came from rehearsal. Witnesses would later recall that his hands were pinned, his head forced back, a hand clamped over his mouth. The priority, according to KGB procedure in such cases, was not only to prevent escape, but to prevent suicide. The capsule in his mouth, if he had time to crack it, would have made all subsequent interrogations meaningless. He did not get the time. The pill remained unbroken. Instead of a quick death on the roadside, he was pushed into another car and taken into the network of detention facilities that the Soviet security services kept for cases like his. Neighbours in his apartment block noticed only that he no longer came home. At Phasotron, colleagues were told nothing official. Rumours circulated: illness, reassignment, some sudden family problem. In the files of the Second Chief Directorate, a different word appeared next to his name: arrested. The walls of Lefortovo prison and the interrogation rooms of Lubyanka were designed less for physical spectacle than for a slow, grinding pressure. For months, Adolf Tolkachev lived in isolation. Interrogations came at irregular times. Sleep was interrupted. Questions were repeated from different angles. Documents were brought in and placed in front of him, some genuine, some carefully selected, to test his reactions. The men across the table were professionals. Many had spent their careers breaking people who had far less to hide. According to fragments of later accounts, he did not try to deny what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming, from his own operations to the information sold by traitors abroad. What he tried to do, instead, was contain the damage to others. He insisted that he had acted alone. He portrayed his motivations as personal hatred of the regime, not part of some broader conspiratorial network. He asked repeatedly that his wife and son be spared the worst consequences. He offered technical explanations, detailed descriptions of what he had passed, in the hope that full cooperation might buy leniency for his family. The KGB had no reason to hurry. They held him for roughly 10 months before bringing him formally before a military court. During that time, they used his existence in another way. As long as his arrest remained secret, they could continue to feed misinformation back to the CIA, or at least exploit the uncertainty his disappearance created. Was he dead? Was he under deep cover? Had he decided to stop? Every scenario that Langley analysts considered had operational implications, and the KGB was content to leave them guessing. When the trial finally came, it was closed to the public. He stood accused under the article of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic's criminal code that dealt with treason in the form of espionage. The charges listed years of passing information, contact with a foreign intelligence service, and damage done to the defense capability of the state. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The sentence was death. The formal record of the sentencing was thin. The act that carried it out was thinner still. A brief note confirming that the judgment had been executed by firing squad. No gravesite was indicated. Bodies of those shot for treason often went to unmarked burial grounds, their locations known only to a small circle inside the security apparatus. Publicly, the Soviet press carried only a terse announcement. A citizen had been condemned and executed for espionage on behalf of a hostile power. No name, no details, just enough to serve as an internal warning to others who might be tempted to do the same. His family did not disappear from the system's sight. His wife, Natalia, was arrested and charged with complicity. The case against her rested not only on what she might have known, but on the logic that no one could live beside such acts without, in some way, sharing guilt. She was sentenced to a term in prison. It was shorter than her husband's journey and ended without a bullet, but it tore out the remaining structure of her life all the same. Their son, Oleg, inherited a label that carried weight in every application, every workplace, every queue: the son of a traitor. In a state that tracked biographies as if they were contagious diseases, that kind of origin could limit admission to universities stall careers, and mark a person in the eyes of neighbours and colleagues. Yet life, even under a system that tried to control every aspect of it, did not always obey bureaucratic predictions. Oleg, by persistence and ability, became an architect in Moscow. The fact that he managed to establish a professional life in the very city where his father had been executed was one of the small ironies history allowed itself in the ruins of grand narratives. For years, he knew less about the specifics of his father's case than strangers in the West who read specialist books. Across the ocean, the reckoning was different. Within the CIA, the loss of their most productive source in the Soviet military-industrial complex triggered investigations and internal reviews. Names like Howard and Ames, when they eventually surfaced as traitors, were placed in timelines that led directly to Adolf's arrest. Questions were asked, sometimes in public hearings, more often in closed rooms, about why protection mechanisms failed, why vulnerabilities went unnoticed or were ignored. Another question, quieter but just as sharp, surfaced among officers who had known his case. Whether the decision to keep him in place, to postpone extraction, had effectively turned him into a consumable asset rather than a person. No memo stated that directly. None needed to. The fact remained that he had continued to operate until external betrayal and the inevitable tightening of the KGB's grip made his arrest more a matter of time than of chance. In the post-Soviet 1990s and 2000s, when some archives opened and memoirs appeared, his story became more widely known. A portrait of Adolf Tolkachev was hung at CIA headquarters, part of a corridor of faces that represented agents who had risked, and in many cases lost, their lives working with the agency. Visitors could read his name, see a brief summary of his contributions, and move on to the next frame. For them, he was one figure in a long series. For the organization, he was proof that even in the most hostile surveilled environment, a single well-placed source could shift the balance of knowledge in a global confrontation. In Moscow, his portrait did not hang on any official wall. The institutions he had damaged remembered him more as a cautionary tale, studied in security briefings, than as a person. The files that recorded his interrogation and execution remained locked away, or were selectively cited to emphasize the efficiency of the state in rooting out traitors. Two parallel memorials existed, one in polished frames and printed histories in Virginia, the other in thin stamped folders in Moscow. Looking back at the case through those two sets of documents, the question of responsibility refuses to settle into a single answer. On one level, the mechanics are simple. The KGB arrested, interrogated, judged, and executed him. They did so under laws designed to criminalize any serious dissent or collaboration with foreign powers. They did so in a state that knew how to make people disappear quietly and had done so many times before. The shot that ended his life was fired by their system in their name. On another level, the chain extends further. Without the anger that came from Stalin's repression of his wife's family, he might never have turned against the state. Without the CIA's capacity to receive him, he might have remained just another bitter engineer complaining in private. Without the personal betrayals of Howard and Ames, the KGB might have taken far longer to identify him, or not have found him at all. There is also the colder calculus inside the organization that had given him a code name and a camera. In memoranda and discussions, his value was discussed in terms of the quality and quantity of information, the impact on Western weapon and countermeasure development, the cost savings. His human risk was part of the analysis, but not the only factor. When the decision to delay or avoid extraction was taken, it was framed not as a sentencing, but as a strategic choice in a larger game. The game ended for him on a road outside Moscow, in a car he had driven 100 times before. For his handlers, it continued in other theatres, with other sources. There is a broader pattern in which his story sits. Totalitarian and authoritarian systems rely on fear not just as a reaction, but as a daily background condition. Stories of traitors, arrested and punished, serve to reinforce that atmosphere, reminding everyone, from engineers in institutes to children in schools, that the boundaries of acceptable thought and action are policed by an organization that sees more than any individual can. At the same time, the agencies that oppose such systems, operating in the name of democratic states, develop their own forms of detachment. They speak of assets, deliverables, yields, risk curves. They count lives and loyalties in charts and graphs. The distance between the language of freedom and the mechanics of how sources are recruited, used, and sometimes lost can be as stark as any ideological divide. Adolf Tolkachev stood at the intersection of those two cold structures. To one, he was a traitor who had to be erased. To the other, he was a resource whose output justified enormous risk. Neither structure was built to accommodate the quiet details, the years of his wife's waiting, the way his son walked through Moscow, carrying a name he could not erase, the small objects that had once been smuggled into their apartment, a Western book, a cassette tape, as tokens of a different world. There is no known recording of his voice in the last months. There is no verified transcript of his final words. What remains instead are two images that never meet. In one, a corridor in Langley, walls painted in neutral colours, quiet air conditioning, the sound of footsteps on polished floors. On the wall, a framed portrait of a thin man with receding hair, his name on a small plaque beneath. Visitors pass, some pausing to read, most moving on. For them, he is a figure in the story of how their side won the Cold War. In the other, an unmarked plot of ground near Moscow, perhaps overgrown, perhaps now under a new layer of construction, where a body once lay in a common grave, tagged only with a number. No flowers, no plaque, just a line in a file noting that a sentence had been carried out. Between those two images lies the price of a choice made by one man in a cramped apartment, in a city under permanent surveillance, in a system that believed it could demand his loyalty forever. He decided it could not. The state answered with a bullet. Another state answered with a portrait. The sum, as always in such stories, was paid by those who did not get to choose at all.